Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about politics in the 1920s. So, if you'd like to follow along, just download the 1920s politics PowerPoint. So, 1919 and 1920, these are going to be years of chaos. There's going to be a lot of strikes. There's going to be some violence. 1920, also, some of that's going to go on. The 1920s are going to be a decade of Republican presidents and Republican policies. We've got Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and then Herbert Hoover. So the 1920s get called the Roaring Twenties because of the economy, but it's going to be a Republican decade. We kind of talked about Woodrow Wilson and how he was a progressive reformer. You have World War I going on. So America has had 8 years of idealism, a lot of change, all the big stuff from World War I, the violations of civil liberties. So Americans are going to be ready for something different. And some of the chaos going on happens on June 2nd, 1919. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy and his wife are returning home from dinner. There's an explosion in their neighborhood. Windows are blown out. Cars are blown up. Trees are on fire everywhere. He runs up to his house to see if his son is still alive because he left his son at home. When he gets to the doorway of his house, he finds body parts. He doesn't know if they're his son's. He rushes up, and his 11-year-old son James is alive in the house. That person, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, was FDR, a young Franklin Roosevelt, who will be president throughout the 1930s and 40s. You can see some pictures on slide 7 of the damage caused. The target of the bombing was the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer. He had been the one that had kind of cracked down on civil liberties during the Wilson years. Basically, what happened was an anarchist had tried to set off a bomb. He had blown himself up. Didn't mean to do this, but they found a pamphlet in a pocket of some of the body parts, and basically it was an attack on capitalism, and so they knew it was an anarchist. That night, a total of 8 bombs go off throughout the Northeast. You can see on slide 10 kind of the map. There's 36 bombings that are also sent to prominent Americans: A. Mitchell Palmer, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Ole Hanson, who's the mayor of Seattle, Thomas Hardwick. Only one of the bombs is successfully delivered. A postal worker discovered them, so they don't actually get delivered. There's a Wall Street bombing in September of 1920. A horse-drawn wagon pulls up to the corner of Wall and Broad Streets. The driver walks away. There's a huge explosion. 40 people are killed. Hundreds are wounded. If you go there today, you can still see the dents in the side of the building from the explosion. And basically what we have is something called the Red Scare. 1919 and 1920, there's a time of hysteria that comes from the fear of communism and radicalism. And it's not totally unfounded. A lot of immigrants had come to America. They brought a lot of foreign ideas like anarchy, communism, socialism. Russia had just gone communist in 1917. There's all these bombings in America. There's tons of labor strikes in the 1919s. So all of these factors contribute to the fear that radicalism has come to America. And Europe is also in the midst of kind of a radical upheaval. There's communist uprisings in Germany and other countries. Europe fears that it might fall to communism. So it's a real fear Americans have. So A. Mitchell Palmer, who wants to win the Democratic nomination for president in 1920, he decides to conduct what has become known as the Palmer Raids. He sees communism as a threat to American democracy, religion, private property, and it is. I mean, communism is the antithesis of American kind of virtues and values found in the Constitution and the Declaration. Palmer said, like a prairie fire, the blaze of revolution is eating its way into the homes of the American workmen. Its sharp tongues of revolutionary heat are licking the altars of the churches, leaping into the belfry of the school bell, crawling into the sacred corners of American homes, burning up the foundations of society. President Wilson says, "Don't let this country see red." So Congress appropriates money to establish the General Intelligence Division in the Justice Department. This becomes the FBI later on. J. Edgar Hoover heads this new agency. So basically, Palmer raids radical gatherings. He rounds up radicals. In November 1919, he raids the offices of the Union of Russian Workers. It's an anarchist group. He raids 12 cities. Almost 250 people are sent back to Russia aboard the Buford or the Burford. It kind of gets nicknamed the Soviet Ark. So he just grabs these radicals and sends them to Russia. In January 1920, federal agents raid 33 cities and take 6,000 people into custody. And remember, after World War I, this doesn't seem like that big of a deal because World War I, you had a lot of violations of civil liberties. So Mitchell Palmer has a high profile, a high public opinion kind of view. He predicts that there's going to be a huge revolution on May Day of 1920. Nothing ends up happening in actuality. So he predicts all this revolution, and then May Day is quiet. So basically, people don't see him as a credible person anymore, and he's not going to get the Democratic nomination. There's strikes in 1919. There's strikes in Seattle. There's strikes with the Boston police. There's steel worker strikes. There's coal strikes across the nation. I'll kind of let you read through some of these. I won't tell you everything about them, but basically the Seattle workers wanted higher wages and shorter hours. Mayor Ole Hansen kind of sees communism behind these labor strikes. Most American laborers are not communists or socialists or anarchists. There are radicals within all these labor groups, so sometimes they get a bad rap because people only see the radicalism, but there are radicals there. Federal troops are brought in. The strike comes to an end, and Mayor Hansen takes credit. He writes a book called Americanism versus Bolshevism and kind of tours the country giving speeches talking about the threat of communism. In Boston, the police go on strike in 1919. They want better pay, working conditions, recognition of their union. There's violence that breaks out. You know, there's no police kind of guarding the streets. People are killed. There's looting going on. Wilson calls this a crime against civilization. You get veterans groups that start to patrol the streets and try to keep order. Eventually, Calvin Coolidge, who is governor of Boston, he orders state troopers to Boston to basically restore order. He fires the entire police department in Boston. He says there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. So Calvin Coolidge's stock goes up on the national stage because he stopped this strike. There's also a steel workers strike. They also want shorter working days, shorter working weeks, recognition of their union. You know, hundreds of thousands of steel workers go on strike. It lasts for months. There is some violence. 4 strikers are killed in Pennsylvania. 18 are killed in Indiana. The federal troops are brought in, and eventually the strike kind of fizzles out. There's also a coal strike. Remember how I told you coal is very vital to the nation. You know, it heats schools, businesses, government buildings. Basically, if you don't have coal, the nation kind of comes to a halt. These strikers want a pay raise. They want less working days, less working hours per day. Basically, the strikers accept a pay raise and the strike ends. There's also race riots that go on. Some of these race riots happen in during World War I. There's the East St. Louis riots of 1917. There's race riots in 1919 that break out across the country. There's Chicago race riots that are pretty big. And basically what you see is if you look on slide 34, between 1910 and 1920, over 1 million blacks moved north. The South is solidly Democratic. Segregation and Jim Crow rule there. Blacks want to go somewhere where they'll get treated better, so they go out west or they go north. And when World War I starts, the the factories of the North need lots of new workers to kind of build the machines that help win the war. So there's a lot of factory jobs drawing blacks to the North. In the St. Louis riots, there's anger over jobs. A lot of times what happens is blacks will move in and the whites will be upset because they take their jobs or they live in the same area of the city with them. There's basically just a lot of racial tension when blacks and whites come together. You know, not everything bad that happens to blacks is in the South. That also happens. Stuff also happens to them in the North and the West. Not nearly as severe, but it can happen. 49 people, black and white, are killed. They're shot, they're stabbed, there's beatings. It's just terrible. 6,000 homes are set on fire. Remember how I said Republicans tend to favor civil rights for blacks? When this happens, Teddy Roosevelt, he goes nationally and says, "We have demanded that the Negro submit to the draft and do his share of the fighting as exactly as the white man does. Surely, when such is the case, meaning the riots, we should give him the same protection by the law that we give the white man. Murder is not debatable." Woodrow Wilson says nothing publicly, so you have the former Republican president saying you can't treat blacks this way, and the Democrats just say nothing. Later on, there's huge race riots in Chicago. Apparently, what set this off is there was a black teenager swimming, and he swam into a whites-only area, or the whites claim he did. Somebody throws a rock at the boy and hits him, and the boy drowns. Rumors spread throughout the city that the story was backwards, that some blacks threw a rock at a white person and made them die, but that's not what happened. So rumors spread, and basically there's a huge race riot throughout the whole city. I've got pictures. If you look at slide 38 on, you can see how homes are destroyed, people are killed, things are vandalized. Almost 40 people are killed, over 500 injured. The National Guard has to be called in, and the National Guard stands patrol on the streets because it's not safe. So 1919 is a year of strikes and race riots. There's also a very famous court case called Vanzetti, Sacco and Vanzetti. These are two Italian immigrants. They're anarchists, and they get charged with a murder of a couple guys during a robbery. A lot of people think that they did not get a fair trial, but they are found guilty and sentenced to death. And there's this huge, almost decade-long effort to save them. Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, gets involved. He asked the Massachusetts governor not to execute them. There's all kinds of public support for them not to be executed, but they are executed in the later 1920s. Different textbooks will give a different explanation. Some textbooks will say they were innocent, they were just targeted because they were immigrants. But I think more today, people realize that they're probably guilty. They might have been not given a fair trial because they were radicals, but they probably still were guilty. Okay, so basically all of that is going on in the late 19 teens, and a lot of Americans are looking for something new. So they look to a man named Warren G. Harding, who I always introduce as the sexiest man alive in the 1920s. He is kind of the sex symbol in politics in the 1920s. I basically tell my students he's the Bill Clinton of the 20s. But if you kind of look at his pictures on 49 and 50, you can kind of see, judge for yourself if he's handsome or not, I don't know. He was born in Ohio. He grows up on a farm. He later becomes a teacher. After his term as teaching is over, he sets out for Marion, Ohio. He rides into town on a donkey. He attempts a lot of different jobs, law, insurance. Nothing really sticks. And he turns to journalism, and he rescues the city's newspaper, the Marion Star. He turns it into a success, and he catches the eye of a lady that's older than him, Florence Kling de Wolf. She chases after him. She ends up getting him to marry her, even though Warren didn't really want to marry her. Her father opposed the marriage. There's rumors that Warren G. Harding has a black ancestor, and her father does not like blacks, so he does not want her marrying him. Warren G. Harding has a ton of affairs throughout his life while he's in Ohio and when he becomes president. Carrie Fulton Phillips is one of the ladies he has an affair with. He's really good friends with Carrie's husband, and whenever Carrie's husband leaves, Warren goes and stays at his house with his wife. Um, he wrote poetry that was very sensual. If you look at slide 55, you can see one of the poems he wrote to his mistress. Later on, he has an affair with Nan Britton in the White House. They produce a child together. She wrote later on about this. You can read what she said on slide 57. But Warren G. Harding gets around. Now, he's a natural politician. He gets into politics. He loves to talk with people. He appears sincere. He gives great speeches. He's basically a fun guy to hang around. He attracts the attention of Harry Dowdery, who's kind of a political thinker who maybe looks for candidates to run. So Harding kind of climbs the ladder. He's an Ohio state senator. He's lieutenant governor. He runs for governor but loses. Later, he's elected to the Senate. Probably what you could say about Harding is that he was pretty honest, but everyone around him was corrupt. That's what happens when he goes to Washington, is he brings all the corrupt people with him. He runs against James M. Cox in 1920. Warren G. Harding sits out on his front porch in Ohio and campaigns. Calvin Coolidge is his vice presidential candidate. The Democrats, James M. Cox and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, travel the country speaking. And this is what Harding basically says. He says, look, we've had decades of progressive reform. We've had the chaos of World War I. America wants to go back to normalcy. He says America's present need is not heroics but helping, not nostrums but normalcy, not revolution but restoration, not agitation but adjustment, not surgery but serenity. So basically, we just need to calm down as a nation. The Democrats are still pushing for the League of Nations. Wilson is still alive at this point, so Wilson kind of has to give his blessings because he's still the most famous Democrat in the country. The Republicans win a huge election. They get 60% of the vote to the Democrats' 34%. They even win the state of Tennessee, which is a southern state, and Oklahoma. One of the things that Warren G. Harding does is he later on, well, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Eugene Debs also runs for president from prison. Remember, he was in prison because of World War I. Later on, Warren G. Harding will free him from prison. Joe Tumulty said the election wasn't a landslide, it was an earthquake. If you look at slide 68, you can see that's Wilson and Harding driving down to take the oath of office. Basically, Wilson started crying during the car trip, and Harding didn't know what to do. Harding said, "Our supreme task is the resumption of our onward normal way. Reconstruction, readjustment, restoration, all of these must follow. We must strive for normalcy to reach stability. We want less government in business and more business in government." If you look at slide 70, these are the people he takes with him to Washington, or the people that work with him. The people that came from Ohio are called his Ohio gang. Some of these people are very honest and worked very hard. Charles Evan Hughes, Herbert Hoover, Andrew Mellon, Vice President Coolidge. They're very honest, hardworking, dedicated citizens, but some of these other guys are pretty corrupt. There's all kinds of kickbacks. Like I said, Harding frees Eugene Debs from prison. A lot of people asked Woodrow Wilson to do that. Once the war is over, what harm can Eugene Debs do? The war's not going on. He can't undermine it. But Wilson refused to let him out of jail. Now, there's a recession in the early 1920s. Warren G. Harding inherited a bad economy. There's 20% unemployment, 5 million Americans out of work. Farmers are suffering the most. World War I required that we increase our food production to feed Europe. All the men in Europe are fighting, so they can't farm. So we basically fed Europe during World War I. Now the men that are alive in Europe go back to farming. We've got too many people farming, so Europe needs less of our food, but we're producing more than ever. So there's the problem of overproduction, and Harding doesn't know what to do. He basically says, "I don't understand these issues. I'm just good at getting elected and kind of being a good politician. I don't necessarily know how to fix issues in American society." Uh, Woodrow Wilson did not have a positive view of Harding's intellect. He looked down on him a lot. Um, President Harding, his policies, he retreats from internationalism. No more of Wilson's internationalism. He rejects progressivism. He favors laissez-faire economics, favors big business, favors tariffs. Laissez-faire just means leave it alone. So basically, leave the economy alone, get the government out of it, and it'll kind of function on its own. Andrew Mellon is the Secretary of the Treasury. Some people call him the greatest Secretary of the Treasury since Alexander Hamilton. He cuts taxes, he cuts spending. Wartime spending was $18 billion. That's a lot. By the mid 1920s, it's down to $3 billion. So the American government really, the Republicans really trimmed the budget. They create a surplus in the Treasury. They do away with a lot of regulation that was around from World War One. Charles Dawes, he runs the Bureau of the Budget. Basically, they oversee the budget of the federal government, the budget of the executive branch. He ends up coming up with a plan to kind of help Germany repay their war reparations. I'll talk about in a little bit. Herbert Hoover is Secretary of Commerce. He basically worked with business and labor to reach voluntary agreements. Hoover is going to be a very important figure at the end of the 1920s. He believes that business and government should cooperate. He believes that people should volunteer to do the right thing. He doesn't like he doesn't like using the government to force people to do the right thing. He likes people to do the right thing on their own. The New York Times wrote that Herbert Hoover is an almost supernatural figure whose wisdom encompassed all branches, whose judgment was never at fault, who knew the answers to all questions and could see in the dark. So a lot of the nation has a high opinion of Hoover. Um, so there's lots of people that are very capable in Harding's administration. Some of the laws that get passed, the Fordney-McCumber Act raises tariffs. Immigration policy changes. You've got the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and then the National Origins Act of 1924. Basically, America reduces immigration in the 1920s. The late 1800s to the early 1900s, there's a lot of immigration in America. America kind of puts the halt on that and says we need to assimilate these immigrants now. Um, President Harding goes to the South and he speaks in Alabama about civil rights for blacks. He says, "I want to see the time come when black men will regard themselves as full participants in the benefits and duties of American citizens. We cannot go on as we have gone on for more than half a century, with one great section of our population set off from real contribution to solving national issues because of a division on race lines." And as he's given this speech, the crowd is segregated because he's in the South. So he kind of calls on the South and the nation to stop doing this. Um, Foreign policy wise, Americans sign a peace treaty with Germany that officially ends the fighting. He normalizes relations with Mexico. He has something called the Washington Naval Conference in the early 1920s. A lot of people thought that armaments caused World War I, a buildup of arms, and during the early 1900s, most countries were building more weapons. So basically, Harding has this huge naval conference, and the goal is to kind of reduce the world's navies so we don't have a future war. Charles Evan Hughes kind of oversees it. Basically, they stop building new battleships, they scrap existing vessels. The United States, Great Britain, and Japan, they have a tonnage ratio of 5 to 3. So for every 5 tons of shipping that the United States and Great Britain have, Japan gets 3. Um, so basically, this whole Washington Naval Conference is an attempt to lower the navies of the world. Now, there's a lot of scandals in the Harding administration. Charles Forbes and the Veterans Bureau. Basically, he rips off money. There's something called the Teapot Dome scandal in Elk Hills, California, and Teapot Dome, Wyoming. Albert Falls, the Secretary of the Interior, basically gets government land turned over to private oil companies and basically uses his power as Secretary of the Interior to make money where he shouldn't have been. So there's lots of scandals going on. Um, Harding doesn't really know what's going on. He's kind of ignorant of what his friends are doing. Um, there's all kinds of scandals with Harry Dowdery, the attorney general, and Jess Smith, a guy that handles money. So what ends up happening is Warren G. Harding goes on this countrywide trip to basically talk to the nation. He sells his newspaper. He writes a will. He goes all the way to Alaska. And on his way back in 1923, he's in San Francisco. He has a heart attack and dies. So Calvin Coolidge becomes the new president. Um, a lot of his people, a lot of these scandals come to the light after Harding dies. So a lot of this stuff doesn't break until after his death. Calvin Coolidge is nicknamed Silent Cal. One time a woman came up to him and said that she said, I just made a bet that I could get you to say more than 3 words, get more than 2 words out of you. And Calvin Coolidge just looks at her and says, you lose. So he's a very quiet man. He's a down to earth president. He would sit out on the White House porch in a rocking chair smoking a cigar, and he would wave at people that would walk by. He takes a lot of naps. He cleans up the scandals of the Harding presidency. He's a very honest president, a very honest person. Sometimes he would send a errand boy to get a newspaper for him, and when the boy came back, he'd be like, "Give me my pennies. I know exactly what this newspaper cost." He's totally unlike Harding. He doesn't drink or play cards or chase women or keep company with those who do. He ends up getting married. There's kind of a funny story about how he and his wife, he goes outside and shaves out on the front lawn, and he's kind of in his long underwear, if you've ever seen that, and he sees his wife, and she kind of giggles at him, and he kind of likes her, and he's got his top hat on as he's shaving. So he's out in his front porch in his long underwear, and he's got a top hat on, and he's shaving, and she kind of finds this funny. Calvin Coolidge supports business, and he sees government as a necessary evil. So he's more in tune with the founding fathers' kind of view of government. He vetoes subsidies for farmers. He argues that when a nation's wealth increases, it's good for everyone. He doesn't believe he's supposed to help individual groups. He's just supposed to have an even policy, and it'll help everyone. He reduces the national debt. He trims the federal budget. He lowers taxes. He has a lot of famous quotes. You can look at slide 97. Um, he does warn of the dangers of greed. If you look at slide 98, you can kind of see what he has to say about that. So he supports business and capitalism, but you can't be greedy. He favors civil rights for blacks. He says there should be no favorites and no outcasts, no race prejudices in government. And basically, Calvin Coolidge has a very prosperous economy. You can look, I got some stats on slide 100. So the economy does really well. Charles Dawes, that banker, he goes to Europe and he comes up with the Dawes Plan. Basically, the United States will loan money to Germany. Germany will invest that money and repay Britain and France. And then Britain and France will repay America their loans. So it's kind of this circle. In 1924, Coolidge runs for re-election. Keep cool with Coolidge. Coolidge or chaos are his slogans. He wins another huge majority. More of the same happens in the second term. Calvin Coolidge doesn't change his policies. There's a huge flood in Mississippi in 1927, and there's something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928. This huge flood, I've got pictures of it. 1,000 people are killed. That's a lot for a flood. 700,000 homeless. Herbert Hoover gets put in charge of this. He's called the great engineer and the great humanitarian. He basically goes to work directing aid efforts. He has 35,000 people working for him. He gets $50 million and less than 1% overhead. Herbert Hoover is a genius when it comes to organizing and doing logistics to solve a problem. You can see all the slide 107, all the pictures of the flood. So he kind of fixes that problem as best you can. In 1928, Kellogg-Briand Pact gets signed. It's basically this agreement to outlaw outlaw war as when you're trying to pursue national policy. So basically, World War I is still on everyone's mind, and the leaders of the world say the only reason you can go to war is for self-defense. You can't go to war to get another country to do something you want. Calvin Coolidge decides not to run for a third term. Herbert Hoover runs instead. He's a Quaker. He was born in Iowa. He's the first president to be born west of the Mississippi. He was an orphan early on. He was sent to live with relatives. He ends up going to Stanford University and becoming a mining engineer. Him and his wife used to translate things from Latin into English for fun. If you look at slide 111, there's a real famous Latin text on mining back thousands of years old. Him and his wife translated it into English. He works all kinds of jobs. He gets hired by mining firms. He travels all over the world. He goes to Australia, China, India, New Zealand, Egypt, Korea. Basically, he finds where you should dig for things like precious minerals, and he's just really good at this. By age 40, he's a millionaire, and he retires and decides to devote himself to helping mankind. He's a big philanthropist. He's also a progressive, so he's a progressive Republican. While World War I started, Hoover is in London, and he uses his own money and the money of his rich friends. He brings home as many Americans as he can. He tries to get them out of the war. He oversaw the Committee for the Relief of Belgium. Basically, Belgium got invaded by Germany. We talked about the rape of Belgium. And what ends up happening is Herbert Hoover raises aid for them. He feeds Europe feeds Belgium. He helps keep Europe from starving. He runs the Food Administration when he comes home. After the war, he goes back to Europe and he basically works all the time to help feed Europe. He even helps out the communists in Russia. Not necessarily the communists, but he helps feed people in Russia. After the Russian Revolution, Russia goes through a civil war. Millions and millions of people starved during the Civil War. So Herbert Hoover is kind of seen as this genius who can fix any problem. At the peace conference, John Maynard Keynes said, "Mr. Hoover is the only man who emerged from the ordeal of Paris with an enhanced reputation." Now, Calvin Coolidge did not like Herbert Hoover. He famously said, "That man has offered me unsolicited advice for 6 years, all of it bad." So Herbert Hoover has never been elected to anything, and he's about to run for president. He runs against Al Smith, who's from New York. Now, Herbert Hoover runs on continued prosperity. He supports prohibition. He supports tariffs. Al Smith is Catholic. He supports alcohol. And he kind of runs on this something called Me Tooism. Hoover talks about this is what we need to do. We need to keep the economy running. We need to keep prosperity. And then Al Smith always says, I agree with that. So he kind of copies Herbert Hoover's campaign. Herbert Hoover says some things he probably shouldn't have said because the Great Depression is right around the corner. He said, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. We have not yet reached the goal, but given a chance to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, we shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from the nation." Al Smith had to talk constantly about how he won't let the Pope interfere with his decisions. A lot of Americans did not trust Catholics because they thought the Pope kind of controlled them. So if we get a Catholic president, will he listen to the Pope about national policy? FDR does the nominating speech for Al Smith. FDR, after World War I, gets polio, and he kind of vanishes from the national stage, but he comes back in 1928. He nominates Al Smith for president. It doesn't go well. If you look at slide 123, this is how good the economy was. The Republicans win a landslide. They win even a lot of southern states. And remember, southern states are Democratic. They're Democrats. They never vote for Republicans because of the race issue. But the economy's so good, even some Democrats vote for Republicans. FDR wins election to the governor of New York in 1928. And the next time we'll kind of see how the Great Depression gives Hoover a lot of trouble.